A boy stepped onto a mine in the dark, and the world exploded. He was 17 years old. He could not vote. He could not buy a drink. He had been in the British Army for less than 2 years, and he was stepping through a frozen minefield in the pitch-black winter of the South Atlantic, following the boot print of the man ahead of him, knowing that one wrong step was the last step. 2 boys exactly his age were already dead somewhere on that mountain. A third would die on his 18th birthday before morning. This was not a defeat. This was a victory. And Britain spent the decade that followed pretending not to understand what that victory had cost. The Battle of Mount Longdon is described by military historians as the most violent close-quarters infantry battle the British Army fought since the Korean War. It has a Victoria Cross. It has a memorial. It has a citation published in the London Gazette and a battle honor on a regimental flag. What it does not have is a prominent place in the public memory of 1982, overshadowed by the surrender, the parades, and the political triumph that followed. Tell me in the comments, had you heard of this battle before today? Because what you are about to discover is not the story the victory parade was designed to tell. Stay until the end. The most important part of this story does not happen on the mountain at all. To understand what happened on Mount Longdon on the night of the 11th and 12th of June 1982, one must first understand the machine that made the battle inevitable, not the British military machine. The machine that matters here is the Argentine military junta, a regime that had been systematically murdering its own citizens for 6 years before it decided to go to war with Britain. Under General Leopoldo Galtieri, Argentina's military government was responsible for the deaths of up to 30,000 of its own people, men and women and students who simply disappeared into the regime's apparatus of detention and murder. By 1982, the junta's popularity had collapsed. The economy was deteriorating. The streets were beginning to fill with protesters. And so the generals made a calculation so catastrophically wrong that it would eventually destroy them. They would take back the Falkland Islands, the remote British overseas territory, 8,000 miles away in the South Atlantic, that Argentina had claimed for a century and called the Malvinas. They believed Britain would protest, but ultimately do nothing. The islands were remote, sparsely populated, and strategically minor. The generals bet their regime on Britain's indifference. They were wrong about everything. On the 2nd of April 1982, 600 Argentine commandos landed on the Falklands and overwhelmed a garrison of 57 Royal Marines in hours. Within 3 days, a British task force of 127 ships was preparing to sail south. And somewhere in that fleet, on a requisitioned luxury cruise liner called SS Canberra, were the men of the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. 3 Para, Britain's rapid deployment spearhead battalion, the finest conventional infantry force Britain could produce. They were going to the bottom of the world to take back a collection of wind-battered islands that most of them could not have located on a map 3 weeks earlier. The battle they would fight there would be the most costly engagement of the entire campaign. Almost no one outside the regiment knows its name, the forgotten battle of a famous war. And this is why it was forgotten. What the men of 3 Para endured before a single shot was fired at Mount Longdon has its own claim on the definition of endurance. They landed at Port San Carlos on the western coast of East Falkland on the 21st of May, wading ashore in water so cold it felt like being struck with something solid. From there, they began what became known simply as the TAB, the Tactical Advance to Battle, a forced march of approximately 50 miles across the most inhospitable terrain in the Southern Hemisphere. The Falklands in June is the Southern Hemisphere winter. The ground is permanently saturated, boggy moorland that swallows boots to the ankle. cut through by rivers that must be forded in full kit, broken by ridgelines of rock that offer no shelter from winds that come straight off the Antarctic Ocean. The men marched through it in freezing rain, in sleet, in horizontal ice that cut exposed skin. Private Nick Rose, a soldier in 6th Platoon B Company, described the conditions with a plainness that no official report can improve upon. "We are horrible," he remembered. "We are miserable as sin, all of us. Missing home, wanting a dry cigarette, warm, dry boots, a cheese and onion sandwich, and a bottle of Blue Top milk. I used to dream of these things. The equipment made everything worse. The boots issued for the campaign were British Army DMS boots with compressed cardboard inners that dissolved in the wet. Not deteriorated, not failed. Dissolved, turning to soft pulp in the conditions that were guaranteed to exist on a South Atlantic island in winter. The cold weather gear had been sourced from another regiment recently returned from Norway and was already at the end of its serviceable life. The men fighting Britain's most important war in a generation were doing it in equipment that belonged in a skip. They reached Teal Inlet on the 29th of May, found somewhere to sleep, and the next morning received orders to march another 30 miles to Estancia House. They marched. That is what these men did. They marched 50 miles across ground, designed to stop an army and equipment, designed by a procurement system that had apparently never visited the South Atlantic, and when they arrived at Estancia House, they began patrolling toward a mountain that loomed dark on the horizon. The man who would define what happened on that mountain was writing a letter somewhere in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. Sergeant Ian John McKay was the son of a steelworker from Wortley, near Barnsley in South Yorkshire, educated at Rotherham Grammar School, who had joined the army at 17 and spent 12 years learning to be the kind of soldier that other soldiers trusted absolutely. He had served in Northern Ireland. He had trained recruits. He had worked his way through the ranks with the methodical dedication of a man who took his responsibilities personally, which he did, because the responsibilities he had by the spring of 1982 were the lives of 28 young men in 4 Platoon B Company. Men he described in the words of those who knew him as his to protect, almost like a mother hen. He was 29 years old. During the sea voyage south, he wrote to a friend with the directness of a man who had thought the matter through completely. "I have no intention of taking any risks and getting killed. If I do, then it will be to protect my men, to save lives." The battalion also contained, spread through its platoons and sections, boys who had not yet had the chance to live the lives McKay had accumulated. 2 of them, Private Ian Scrivens and Private Jason Burt, were 17, not 18, not 19, 17 years old, young men who were not old enough to vote in the country they were sailing to defend. Private Neil Gross had turned 18 the previous day. The Army knew their ages. The Army sent them anyway. This detail is placed here at the beginning because it will matter enormously later, in a way that is impossible to process properly if you encounter it for the first time at the end. What waited for all of them was a long, narrow ridge of quartzite rock and frozen mud that ran east to west above the boggy ground northwest of Port Stanley. Mount Longdon was not a dramatic peak. It was a bleak, dark, jagged spine of rock, rising perhaps 300 meters above sea level, its slopes broken by outcrops of boulders the size of houses and carpeted with ankle-breaking tussock grass that made every step uncertain. But its position was everything. From its summit, an observer could look directly down onto every approach to Port Stanley, the roads, the open ground, the dead ground between the ridge lines. As long as Argentine forces held Mount Longdon, British forces could not advance toward the capital without being observed and targeted and destroyed by artillery called down from above. The mountain was a key, and Port Stanley was the lock, and there was no way around it. Defending that key was B Company of Argentina's 7th Infantry Regiment, under the local command of 34-year-old Major Carlos Carrizo Salvadores. His force numbered approximately 278 men, reinforced by 2 Marine infantry platoons that brought with them professional military training, night vision equipment, and 6 Browning heavy machine guns capable of cutting a man in half at 500 meters. Not just a defensive position, a killing machine specifically engineered for the terrain it occupied, with fields of fire covering every predictable approach to the summit. Most of Carrizo Salvadores' men were conscripts with approximately 1 year of military training. The British intelligence assessment of their likely fighting quality was dismissive. They were teenagers playing soldier was the operational assumption at several levels of command. This assumption would prove to be one of the most expensive intelligence failures of the entire Falklands campaign. The Argentine conscripts had been living on that mountain for weeks. They knew every rock, every approach, every piece of dead ground. They had dug their bunkers into the quartzite so deeply that direct artillery hits sometimes failed to penetrate. And the Argentine NF-AL rifle was configured for fully automatic fire. The British L1A1 SLR was semi-automatic only. In close quarters, combat in the dark, the man who can fire faster survives. The Argentine engineers of the 10th Mechanized Engineer Company had done something else as well. In the weeks before the British assault, Lieutenant Diego Arisaigor's platoon of sappers had laid 1,500 anti-personnel mines along the western and northern slopes of Mount Longdon. 1,500 mines. British sappers would later count them with the grim precision of men who understood what those numbers represented. Corporal Peter Cuxon made the point with characteristic understatement. Only 2 exploded, he said, because the rest were frozen. Otherwise, the final battle for Port Stanley would have been an altogether different story. The South Atlantic winter, which had made every step of the tab a misery, had accidentally saved the lives of hundreds of British paratroopers by freezing the detonators in the ground beneath their feet. The British had been probing the mountain since the 3rd of June. Captain Matthew Selfridge and Captain Robbie Burns established a patrol base near Murrell Bridge, 2 kilometers west of Longdon, from which specialist patrols went out nightly to map Argentine positions, count machine gun emplacements, and learn the rhythm of the sentries. It was dangerous, meticulous work. On the night of the 6th and 7th of June, one of those patrols was driven back by a fighting patrol from Argentina's 601 Commando Company in a chaotic firefight at the bridge. The British withdrew under pressure, leaving behind packs, equipment, and critically a radio set with signals instructions. If the Argentines had read those instructions, the battalion's radio codes were compromised. The defenders were not surprised strategically. They knew the British were coming. What they didn't know was the direction, the timing, or the silence with which the attack would begin. At 19:30 hours on the 10th of June, Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike gathered his company commanders in the regimental aid post at Estancia House and issued the orders that would define the lives of everyone in that room. The plan had an elegance to it that felt almost mathematical. Reconnaissance from D Company had established that the Argentine defenders expected an attack from the north. Pike would attack from the west, a direction less heavily mined, less expected, and covered by sufficient darkness to allow a silent approach within striking distance of Argentine trenches before anyone knew they were there. B Company, under Major Mike Argue, would lead the assault against the western summit, which 3 para named Fly Half, and push on to the eastern summit they called Full Back. A company would be in reserve. The objectives were named after positions in rugby, a British Army naming a killing ground after a game. The 3 simultaneous attacks, 3 para on Longdon, 45 Commando on Two Sisters, 42 Commando on Mount Harriet, were designed to happen at the same moment, precisely because they could not support each other. 3 separate battles on 3 separate mountains, coordinated so that no Argentine position could release troops to reinforce another. H-hour was set for 200 hours. The plan required everything to go exactly right. Plans that require everything to go exactly right generally do not survive contact with the enemy. As dusk fell on the 11th of June, 3 Para moved to their start lines and began the 4-hour advance toward the mountain they could not see. 300 men moving in absolute silence across boggy ground in total darkness, guided by compass bearing and the memory of aerial photographs, forbidden to use light or noise of any kind. The weather was doing what Falklands weather does in June: freezing winds off the South Atlantic, intermittent sleet, visibility measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. The men moved in single file on the tracks and in staggered formation across the open ground, placing feet with the careful deliberateness of men who understood that the ground ahead was seeded with death. Private Trevor Bradshaw described it years later with a plainness that no formal account can improve. "We walked through that minefield," he said, knowing every step could be disastrous, still under fire, in the dark, desperately trying to put your boot into the mark made by the chap in front. It was grim. They moved through 1,500 mines, most of them frozen, and they lost no one to the ground. The silence held. The approach held. For 4 hours the plan was working exactly as designed. And then Corporal Brian Milne put his foot down in the wrong place. The explosion was muffled by the frozen ground. The sound that followed it was not muffled at all. Corporal Milne's screams cut through the Falklands night and reached the ears of the Argentine platoon 200 meters up the slope. More than 20 Argentine soldiers emerged from their tents into the darkness with weapons raised. The ones still struggling out of their sleeping bags were caught by Lieutenant Ian Bickerdyke's 4 platoon, arriving at speed, machine gunning and grenading positions that had not yet fully organized their response. The silent assault was over. What replaced it was something that none of the planning documents had a proper term for: a close-quarters infantry battle in complete darkness on a mountain designed to kill the people climbing it. The area immediately above the western approach to the summit would later be called Grenade Alley by the men who survived it. The name is literal. The northern slope of Longdon rises almost vertically in sections, broken by rock outcrops that provide perfect defensive positions above and almost no cover for anyone climbing. Argentine defenders above could simply roll grenades downhill. They did not need to aim. They needed only to pull the pin and release, and gravity completed the equation. British paratroopers climbing in the dark with the weight of their ammunition and weapons, lungs burning in the cold wind, hands frozen to their rifles, had grenades arriving from above as a constant percussion, some exploding, some rolling past, harmlessly, none predictable. Through it, B Company fought with the kind of violence that is difficult to describe without either sanitizing or sensationalizing, and this account will attempt neither. Privates Ben Goff and Dominic Gray crawled through the fire to within arm's reach of an Argentine bunker whose occupants were shooting at British soldiers below them. They posted grenades through the firing slit. When the grenades went off, they went in with bayonets and finished what the grenades had started. Both men were mentioned in dispatches. The official language of military commendation does not capture what it actually means to do what they did in the dark at 20 years old, because there is no language designed for that purpose. Sub-Lieutenant Juan Baldini, commanding Argentina's 1st Platoon, was killed in the early fighting. He had stood up to clear a jammed machine gun at the worst possible moment, and a British round hit him in the stomach. Corporal Dario Rios was found dead beside him. Baldini's weapon and boots were taken by British soldiers afterward. The boots were taken for a specific reason that tells its own story about the state of British Army equipment in 1982. The DMS boots were failing in the mud, and the dead man's boots were better than the ones the living were wearing. Lieutenant Jonathan Shaw's 6th Platoon reached the western summit of Fly Half without heavy resistance and believed they had secured it. They had not. In the darkness, they had missed a half-dozen Argentine conscripts who had sheltered in bunkers and waited. Those men came out after 6th Platoon's main element had passed them and attacked the platoon from behind, from the direction that was supposed to be clear, causing casualties in positions that were supposed to be safe. The fog of night combat does not discriminate. It kills the attacker and the defender with equal indifference. By this point in the battle, somewhere in the first hours of the 12th of June, B Company had taken the western summit, but could make no further progress toward full back. The eastern ridge was now defended by men with something that changed everything. The Argentine engineering reinforcements from 2nd Lieutenant Hugo Quiroga's platoon of the 10th Engineer Company had arrived at full back, and they had brought head-mounted night vision equipment that allowed them to see in darkness that was effectively blind for the British. What followed was systematic. Argentine defenders, who could see, picked off British soldiers who could not see them. 4 Platoon and 5 Platoon were pinned on the ridge, taking casualties from positions they could neither identify nor suppress. Private Nick Rose of 6th Platoon described watching his friends die in sequence, in the way that men remember catastrophe, not as a sweep of violence, but as individual, specific, irreversible moments. Pete Gray stood up to throw a grenade and was shot in the forearm by a sniper, and they punched his arm down to stop the bleeding, thinking the grenade had gone off and taken his hand. But his arm was still there, just bending the wrong way at the forearm instead of the elbow. A horrible thing to watch. Then Tony Greenwood, his friend, whom he called Fester, took a round above his left eye a yard away. That was a terrible thing, Rose said. Fester was such a lovely guy. Then Baz Barrett, who had gone back to find field dressings for Pete Gray, was shot in the back on the way to bring them forward. This was when the platoon stalled. Brigadier Julian Thompson, commanding 3 Commando Brigade, was later direct about what he was observing in those hours. He said he was on the point of withdrawing his paras from Mount Longdon. We could not believe, he said, that these teenagers disguised as soldiers were causing us to suffer many casualties. The brigade commander, watching the battle through the reports coming in from the ridge, was considering ordering a retreat. The entire strategic plan, the simultaneous 3-mountain assault, designed to break the Argentine perimeter around Port Stanley in a single night, was on the edge of producing not a victory, but a catastrophe. Every man already dead on the slope had died in a battle that was now approaching the moment of failure. Lieutenant Ian Bickerdike moved forward with Sergeant McKay and a small group to reconnoiter the machine gun position doing most of the damage, a direct approach under covering fire, trying to locate the exact position so it could be suppressed or flanked. A bullet hit Bickerdike in the leg. He went down. Command of 4 Platoon passed to Sergeant McKay. An hour before this moment, McKay had told Company Sergeant Major John Weeks something that Weeks would carry for the rest of his life. He had come up to Weeks in the darkness before the battalion crossed the river into their assault formations. He said, "I am not going to come back from this." Weeks heard it and filed it in the place where soldiers file things they cannot process during a battle. On the ship, weeks earlier, McKay had written to a friend, "I have no intention of taking any risks and getting killed. If I do, it will be to protect my men, to save lives." He was a man who thought clearly about what he was prepared for. The clarity was not bravado, it was calculation. He assessed the situation. He understood it precisely. The machine gun position was approximately located by Bickerdike's reconnaissance before the bullet ended it. The platoon could not advance while it operated. The night vision-equipped defenders were reducing 4 and 5 platoons toward collapse. The brigade commander was considering withdrawal. Not just the platoons, not just B Company, but the entire strategic operation was at a pivot point. McKay issued orders. He took Corporal Ian Bailey, Private Jason Burt, who was 17 years old, and 1 other soldier. He covered them with machine gun fire from the platoon's position, and then broke cover and charged. The Argentine position opened up immediately. Corporal Bailey was seriously wounded and went down. The other private was hit and fell. Jason Burt, 17 years old, too young to vote, barely old enough to wear the uniform he died in, was killed. McKay was the only man still moving. He continued forward. There is no other way to say this. He continued forward alone, across open ground, directly into the fire of a defended position whose occupants were actively trying to kill him, knowing from everything his training and experience had taught him exactly what the mathematics of this decision looked like. He reached the position. He threw grenades. His body was found afterward lying across the bunker he had just cleared. 4 platoon and 5 platoon could move again. Brigadier Thompson did not order the withdrawal. The battle continued. It continued because more men like McKay existed in different forms throughout 3 para that night. Not one of them seeking anything except the survival of the men they were responsible for. The machine gun position was silenced, but full back remained in Argentine hands, and A Company was moving to pass through B Company for the final assault when the Argentine response arrived. First Lieutenant Raúl Fernando Castaneda's platoon, dispatched at midnight by Major Carrizo Salvadores, who had been tracking the battle and understood his position was under serious threat, hooked around the existing Argentine defensive line and launched a counterattack that drove into the chaos of the B Company positions, and then pushed further. Castaneda's men found an even more dangerous target, the British regimental aid post on the western slopes, where more than 20 wounded British paratroopers were lying incapacitated in the dark. Corporal Jorge Arribas was leading the section moving toward them. He was advancing on men who could not run, could not fight, and could not protect themselves. Color Sergeant Brian Faulkner saw what was happening. He grabbed 4 men who were still functional, got to a piece of high ground above the aid post, and opened fire. The Argentines who reached the kill zone did not leave it. Not one of them, Faulkner said afterward, was left standing when they finished. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. The citation is specific and correct. What it cannot convey is the image of a senior NCO selecting 4 men from the walking wounded to defend a position full of men who could not walk, and then doing so successfully because there was no other choice available, and he was the kind of man who finds a way when there is no other choice. The counterattack stalled. A company under Major David Collett moved through the remnants of B Company and assaulted full back in the cold gray beginning of dawn. Not darkness now, but the half-light of a Falklands winter morning, which offered slightly better visibility and slightly less cover, a trade that neither side would have chosen. The assault was made with rifle, grenade, and bayonet, the weapons of the previous century employed, because the terrain and the proximity of friend to enemy made anything else impossible. Corporal Stuart McLaughlin, who had fought with exceptional courage throughout the entire night, clearing positions, leading sections, doing the work that keeps a battle moving when officers go down, was hit by a round from a recoilless rifle at the moment of the position's final clearance. He was being moved toward the aid post when a mortar round from the Argentine positions on Tumbledown found him. He died at the moment of victory on a mountain that had been trying to kill him since midnight. Mount Longdon was secured by 1100 hours on the 12th of June. The battle had lasted approximately 12 hours. The mountain was in British hands. And then the Argentine artillery began. Sub-Lieutenant Marcelo de Marco, an Argentine Marine artillery observer positioned on Tumbledown Mountain to the east, had a direct line of sight onto the Para positions on Longdon. For 36 hours after the battle ended, de Marco's corrections brought Argentine shells onto Mount Longdon with the regularity of a clock. 4 more British soldiers were killed. 7 more were wounded. The paratroopers who had survived the night battle, who had fought through Grenade Alley, and the machine gun positions, and the Argentine counterattack and the defense of the aid post, sat on the rocks of the mountain they had won and were shelled to death in the daylight. The casualty count for the Battle of Mount Longdon was 23 British dead, including attached personnel, and 43 wounded. The dead were Sergeant Ian McKay, Corporal Stevie Hope, Corporal Keith McCarthy, Corporal Stuart McLaughlin, Lance Corporal Pete Higgs, Lance Corporal Chris Lovett, Lance Corporal James Murdoch, Lance Corporal David Scott, Private Richard Absolon, Private Gerald Bull, Private Jason Burt, Private Jonathan Crow, Private Mark Dodsworth, Private Tony Greenwood, Private Neil Gross, Private Pete Hedeker, Private Tim Jenkins, Private Craig Jones, Private Stuart Lang, Private Ian Scrivens, Private Phil West, Corporal Scott Wilson of the Royal Engineers, and Craftsman Alex Shaw of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. 2 of those names belonged to 17-year-old boys. 1 belonged to a man who had turned 18 the previous day. These are not statistics. They are men who had names before they had ranks, and had ranks before they had graves. With Mount Longdon, 2 sisters, and Mount Harriet all secured in the same night the ring around Port Stanley was broken. Argentine forces surrendered on the 14th of June, 2 days after the battle, while Lieutenant Colonel Pike was in the process of issuing orders for the next assault. The news traveled faster than the official notification system. Some families of the men who had died on Mount Longdon learned of the Argentine surrender from radio and television broadcasts before they had been formally told that their son or husband had been killed in the battle that made the surrender possible. The machinery of bureaucratic notification moved at the speed of administrative process, while the media moved at the speed of news. This was not anyone's deliberate cruelty. It was an institutional failure of the kind that institutions are most prone to. The failure to consider that the people most affected by a war's outcome are the people waiting at home. Britain celebrated. The task force came home to crowds and bands and flags and photographs of smiling soldiers lining the decks. The victory was real, and it deserved to be celebrated. A military operation of extraordinary complexity had been conducted 8,000 miles from home against a larger force in atrocious conditions, and had succeeded. The men who came back accepted the celebration with the quiet reserve of people who understood that the crowds were celebrating something slightly different from what they had actually experienced. The parades moved on. The newspapers moved on. The politicians moved on. The men of 3 Para returned to barracks, and to families, and to civilian life in some cases, and they carried something that 1982 did not yet have a fully established name for. Post-traumatic stress disorder had been added to the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders only 2 years earlier in 1980, and the British military medical establishment had barely begun to process what this relatively new clinical language meant for men who had spent 12 hours on a mountain clearing bunkers with grenades and bayonets. The operational assumption at the highest levels was that the long sea voyages to and from the South Atlantic had provided sufficient decompression time, that the weeks at sea sailing home past the equator and into the North Atlantic had given men enough psychological distance from what they had seen and done to return to normal functioning. This assumption was wrong. Not wrong through malice. Wrong through the specific kind of institutional blindness that occurs when people who have not experienced something decide in the comfort of their offices how much time is sufficient to recover from it. No research was conducted into the psychological casualties of the Falklands War by the British Ministry of Defense until the mid-1990s. More than a decade after the battle, the focus of military medical research in that period drifted toward Gulf War syndrome, toward hypotheses about toxic exposure and environmental causes of illness, while the simpler and harder question of what prolonged close-quarters combat does to the human mind was left largely unexamined in official terms. Studies that eventually emerged told a story that the official silence had been concealing. A study of 64 Falklands veterans still serving in the British Army found that half reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and 22% met the full clinical criteria. The presence of symptoms correlated directly with the intensity of combat experience. No battle in the Falklands War was more intense than Mount Longdon. The research did not require a complicated model to understand. It required only the willingness to ask, not just the absence of treatment, but the absence of acknowledgement. Not just the absence of acknowledgement, but the active institutional preference for a different story. The story of a clean victory, a just cause, professional soldiers who had done their job and come home ready to do the next one. The men who did not fit that story, who came home and could not sleep, who flinched at loud noises, who could not explain to their wives or children or civilian employers what had happened to them, because there were no words for it that the 1980s had found acceptable. Those men were the cost of the official story, and the official story had very little space for them. The South Atlantic Medal Association, the organization representing Falklands veterans, claimed in 2002 that 264 veterans had taken their own lives since the war ended, a number that exceeded the 255 who had died in active service. This claim circulated widely precisely because it was believable. Later, more rigorous statistical analysis found that the actual figure was lower, approximately 95 verified suicides attributable to veterans of the campaign, and that the overall suicide rate among Falklands veterans was not statistically elevated above the rate for servicemen who had not deployed. These findings were important and should be reported accurately. They were also in a specific and painful way beside the point. The fact that the number was widely believed, that hundreds of families and comrades believed it was plausible that more men had died by their own hand than had died in battle, was itself a measure of something real. Not a statistical finding, but a felt truth. The war had not ended at the Argentine surrender. It had continued in ways invisible to the parades and the medals and the official record. The mountain itself has not changed. It is the same bleak ridge above the same boggy moorland, northwest of Port Stanley, that it was on the night of the 11th of June, 1982. Veterans have returned to it on anniversaries, in groups, and alone. Old men in Falklands winter light standing on rocks where young men stood in the dark, laying crosses, observing silence. For more than 30 years, the cross marking the exact spot where Sergeant McKay fell stood in the wrong location, over 100 meters from where his body was actually found, placed in the chaos and darkness and urgency of the aftermath, and never corrected because the battle's confusion extended into its commemoration. Veterans finally corrected it in 2013, 31 years after his death, carrying a cross built in a garage in Liverpool to the right place on the mountain. The last Victoria Cross of the 20th century is displayed in the Lord Ashcroft Gallery at the Imperial War Museum in London. McKay's medals were sold by his wife Marika in 1989. She later said she was incredibly proud of what he had been awarded, but that a part of her just wished he had hidden behind a rock. She said his Victoria Cross was not just for him, but for all his comrades, which is exactly the kind of thing the kind of man he was would have wanted said. The battle has a memorial. It has books written by veterans, by historians, by James O'Connell, who was wounded on the mountain and spent the years afterward ensuring that the men he served with are not forgotten. The battle is described by military historians as the most violent close-quarters infantry fight the British Army conducted since Korea. It has a battle honor on a regimental flag. It remains, despite all of this, the battle that the wider public has largely never heard of, overshadowed by the surrender that followed 2 days later, absorbed into the larger narrative of a victorious war and a political transformation, the forgotten battle of a famous conflict, remembered faithfully by the regiment that fought it, and by the families of the men who did not come home, and by almost no one else. Here is what the history books prefer to remember about the Falklands War: the parades, the flags, the political transformation, the military achievement of projecting power 8,000 miles and defeating a larger force through professional excellence and extraordinary logistics. Here is what the history books prefer not to linger on: the boy stepping through the minefield in the dark, following the boot print of the man ahead, knowing every step could be the last one. The two 17-year-olds who did not come back, the one who did not come back on his 18th birthday, the sergeant who told his company sergeant major 1 hour before the battle that he knew he was not coming back, and who turned out to be right in the most specific and literal and costly way possible. Sergeant Ian McKay wrote on a ship in the South Atlantic that if he died, it would be to protect his men and to save lives. He did not write that as a prediction. He wrote it as a principle, the thing that organized his understanding of what he was prepared to do and why. Within weeks, he demonstrated that principle in the most complete way available to a human being. The men who lived because of what he did came home. Some of them are still living. Some of them spent years dealing with what that mountain put inside them, without institutional support, without acknowledgement, without the language that might have helped them understand that what they were experiencing had a name and a cause, and was not weakness. The support they deserved did not arrive for a decade. The memorial cross stood in the wrong place for 31 years. 23 names on a mountain in the South Atlantic. A Victoria Cross in a museum case in London. A decade of official silence about what the battle actually cost the men who survived it. You know all three now. The question is what you do with the knowing. Whether a battle this significant, fought by men this extraordinary, deserves to remain in the half-shadow of a more famous victory. Leave your answer in the comments, and know that by watching until this moment, you have already given one.